to now use the basic knowledge of hormones, receptors, and this process of feed-forward signaling and feedback negative control. Negative feedback, positive feed-forward. We're going to do that, use those concepts, and get into the details of the pituitary. That's what we're focusing on right now, is the pituitary gland. All right, here's a slide. We're right here to see it. So here's a midline sagittal section through a human person's head. Right? So there's things you ought to be able. So in the past, when we had more time, I went around the room and I asked people to label something here. So you should do this as homework. You should be able to look at this and say, okay, there's the top of the nose, so that's probably the olfactory epithelium, right? And there's the olfactory bulb, corpus callosum, frontal lobe, occipital lobe. There's the calcarine sulcus that you learned about. So use as homework, go through and label the things that you can see. I'm not using the names, but, well, corpus callosum, fornix, lateral ventricle behind the septum pellucidum, thalamus, midbrain, cerebellum, pons, medulla, spinal cord, thalamus, hypothalamus. Now we're getting into what we need to know. Hypothalamus, pituitary. This is where the pituitary is, connected to the hypothalamus. This white matter right here is the optic chiasm. So it's a landmark. Big white spot, optic chiasm. Right below the optic chiasm is the pituitary, and behind the optic chiasm is the hypothalamus. These are important, they are connected. The pituitary is in a little indentation in a bone, the base of the skull. And the name of that indentation has a name that I'm not going to ask you to know. These holes here are the sinuses of the skull, frontal sinus. I'm not going to ask you to know those either. Hypothalamus, pituitary. That's what we're focusing on. Hypothalamus, pituitary, in cartoon version. Let's unpack this slide. There are two separate parts of the pituitary. There is the anterior pituitary, and there is the posterior pituitary. They are very different. Let's do the posterior pituitary first. The posterior pituitary gland is really the secretion sites for hypothalamic neurosecretory cells. So the hypothalamus is part of the brain. These green blobs are supposed to be the cell bodies of hypothalamic neurons. Some of the hypothalamic neurons send axons to the posterior pituitary. If you look carefully, you can see green endings here. Let me say that again. Some of the hypothalamic neurons, neurosecretory cells, send axons to the posterior pituitary where they release their hormone. And the hormones that I will want you to know that are released in the posterior pituitary are vasopressin and oxytocin. just looking ahead, vasopressin is going to be essential for the kidney and its ability to retain water, fluid, when you're dehydrated, for example. And oxytocin is going to be important for childbirth because it triggers contraction during labor. It's going to be important for the production of milk after childbirth. And it's an important hormone for both male and female behaviors. That's going ahead. Vasopressin and oxytocin are the two hormones of the posterior pituitary that I do want you to know. Okay? Now, anterior pituitary is really different. Well, somewhat different. Hypothalamic neurons, neurosecretory cells, project to the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So these you can notice there's no green endings here in the anterior pituitary. Hypothalamic neurons, some of them, their axons end in this connection called the median eminence. It's also called the infundibulum, which is a fun word to say. Infundibulum just means sort of neck. Anyway, hypothalamic neurosecretory cells release their hormone in the median eminence. And then a specialized blood system carries the hormone to the anterior pituitary. So things that are similar are that neurosecretion happens from the hypothalamus, release of hormones either in the posterior pituitary or in the median eminence. And in the case of the anterior pituitary, the hormone is carried from the median eminence to the anterior pituitary via a specialized blood stream here called the portal circulation. So this is a microscopically small, tiny set of capillaries that carries blood from the median eminence to the anterior pituitary. And in the anterior pituitary, there are cells that respond to the hormones that are released here and release hormones into the systemic bloodstream, where it has systemic effects. So in this case, we have to think about hypothalamic release into a portal circulation and anterior pituitary cells releasing into the systemic circulation. Over here, we don't have to worry about the two circulations because these hormones are released into the systemic circulation. So let's for example here, let's take an example. Some of these neurosecretory cells release a hormone called TRH. TRH stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone. This is a thyroid story. Some of these neurosecretory hormones release TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, into the portal circulation, where it travels to the anterior pituitary. Some of the cells in the anterior pituitary, not all of them, some of them express receptors for TRH. Those cells respond to TRH by releasing TSH. TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, now you know what this is going to do. It's going to release TSH into the systemic circulation. It's going to go everywhere, but the receptors for TSH are expressed in the thyroid gland. So we have TRH release, stimulating the thyrotropes, the specific cells of the anterior pituitary, to make TSH. TSH goes into the systemic circulation everywhere, triggering the release of thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland. Small local circulation, big systemic circulation. Does the TRH that is released into the portal circulation get to the systemic circulation? Yes, it does. But the concentration of TRH in the systemic circulation is so small because it has evolved for being released into this little bit of circulation, of capillary. All it needs to do is get from the median eminence to the anterior pituitary, where it stimulates the thyrotropes to make TSH. And then TSH is secreted in large volumes to get larger amounts, because it goes into the systemic, into the 5 liters of systemic blood. It goes into all 5 liters of systemic blood, but its target is the thyroid. But there's no direct port from the anterior pituitary to the thyroid other than the systemic circulation. So this is a specialized circulation, and this is just general systemic circulation. We are going to unpack all of this alphabet soup now over the next 2 weeks. So remember the story of feed forward and feedback control. Let's get to this, let's unpack that with more details regarding the thyroid story. So I'm reinforcing the knowledge and then now combining the knowledge that you have about thyroid story and feedback story. The hypothalamus says we need more thyroid hormone. It detects that for somehow. So some of the cells of the hypothalamus release TRH. TRH travels to the median eminence. TRH is released at the median eminence and travels to the anterior pituitary. The cells of the anterior pituitary that have TRH receptors release TSH. Those cells are called thyrotropes. What makes them special and what makes them different from the other cells of the anterior pituitary? They express receptors for TRH, and they express the mechanisms for secreting TSH. That's what makes them different from the other cells of the anterior pituitary. Those cells respond to TRH and synthesize TSH and release it. TSH goes to the systemic circulation. It's going everywhere, but it interacts with cells in the thyroid, and the thyroid produces the thyroid hormones. These are amine hormones, T3 and T4. And they have effects. It affects the development of the brain. It affects metabolism. So people who are hypothyroid are constantly feeling cold, and people who are hyperthyroid are constantly feeling overheated and, like, I can't stand it, it's too hot in here, where other people are wearing sweaters. People, babe in development, if there is a problem with thyroid hormone production, problem with brain development, mental mental, cognitive, neurodevelopmental defects can happen if there is a decrease in thyroid hormone during fetal development. Growth. We think of growth as being, growth hormone, but thyroid hormone is important for growth. If there is a defect in thyroid hormone, the babies develop small. So bone and muscle development is also dependent on T3 and T4. We'll get to the effects later. What we're talking about is the feed-forward positive stimulation. Now, having introduced hypothyroid and hyperthyroid, we realize, okay, the correct level is what we need. Not too much, not too little. We need the Goldilocks level of thyroid hormone. And so there is negative feedback, both of T3, so T3 and T4 inhibit the production of TSH by the anterior pituitary. They also inhibit the production of the release of TRH by the hypothalamus into the median eminence. So we have two levels. We actually have three. There's also a feedback of TSH that inhibits TRH. So we have negative feedback loops from the hormone that is produced, inhibiting the pituitary and inhibiting the hypothalamus in order to maintain the sweet spot of thyroid hormone levels necessary for metabolism, growth, and especially during development. I do not want you to memorize any differences between T3 and T4. They are different, but we're going to lump them together. So don't focus on this T3, T4 story here. Just lump them together. They both do negative feedback. They both have effects on the brain, on bone, on muscle, on various parts of your body. Multiple effects in the tissues. Questions about the story here that this is illustrating? So, question, I didn't give you time to ask a question. So you can imagine, well, not imagine, I've shown you that there's going to be multiple versions of this story. We just unpacked the TRH, TSH, thyroid hormone story. Now we're going to unpack, step by step, these other stories. So, I hate teaching from a table, but in this case it's helpful. So let's teach from this table, or let's learn from this table. This column is the name of the hormone that is released by the hypothalamus into the portal circulation at the median eminence. And this is the name of the cells and the effects in the anterior pituitary of those hormones. So here's the thyroid story. So some hypothalamic neurosecretory cells release TRH into the portal circulation at the median eminence. TRH travels a short distance in the blood to the anterior pituitary, where it interacts with the thyrotropes, there's the word and you can spell it out, thyrotropes, and it stimulates the thyrotropes because they express TRH receptors, and they release TSH into the systemic circulation, and it has multiple effects that we'll get into later. Okay, so there's that story that we've already told. other hypothalamic hormones, other hypothalamic neurosecretory cells release a hormone called growth hormone releasing hormone. The name is somewhat descriptive. You can see where we're going to go. GHRH is released by these neurosecretory cells into the median eminence. Portal circulation carries it to the anterior pituitary. It binds to GHRH receptors that are expressed on the somatotropes. Somato means body. So growth is referring to body growth. Somatotropes bind GHRH, respond to that binding, I think it's GS, and stimulate the release of growth hormone. And the name that you can imagine, growth hormone stimulates growth. It's especially important before puberty, but even after puberty, we are expressing, releasing, and having effects of growth hormone. But mostly, it's most effective fetal development and puberty, adolescent development. So GHRH released into the median eminence, portal circulation, somatotropes respond, bind and respond, release growth hormone. Other neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus release CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, into the median eminence, portal circulation, binds to the CRH receptor on the corticotropes, stimulates them to release ACTH. ACTH is going to have an effect on the adrenal gland for the release of cortisol. So corticotropes is referring to the fact that corticotropes do not release cortisol. They release ACTH, which triggers cortisol release from the adrenal. Okay? Story. So anterior pituitary, hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, hormone that has an effect downstream. We've done TRH. Other cells, so I'm just using the language again. Other cells in the hypothalamus release GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, into the portal circulation at the median eminence. Portal circulation carries it where it binds to GnRH receptors that are expressed on gonadotropes. Gonadotropes release hormones called FSH and LH in both male and female. And LH and FSH are hormones associated with human reproduction. So we're going to get to the effects of LH and FSH when we talk about male and female reproductive endocrinology. Dopamine, it's a neurotransmitter, but now it's acting as a hormone. Some cells of the hypothalamus release dopamine. Now we've got an interesting switch here. We've got a little switcheroo. Dopamine inhibits the response of lactotropes. So dopamine inhibits lactotropes in the anterior pituitary from releasing prolactin. So we now have a negative feed forward. All of this is positive feed forward. Now we have a negative feed forward. This is not feedback, this is feed forward, but it's negative. So the dopamine released by the hypothalamus is putting the brakes on the anterior pituitary so that it doesn't produce prolactin all the time. You can probably guess that from the name of it, that this is important for the production of milk by the mammary gland after childbirth. the brakes are put on until childbirth. And then the brakes are let go, and prolactin release happens, and the breasts produce milk.
Bob?
Yeah.
So, prolactin release, is this kind of, I guess, hormone action possible for those who have undergone like an XY hormone development?
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, so, how do I say this? So people who are genetically male and don't develop their mammary glands in a similar way as people who are genetically female do, are they also capable of prolactin release as a result of hormone release from the hypothalamus at any point?
So the short answer is, I think so. Males do have sort of vestigial breasts. Males can develop breast cancer, for example, and breast cancer in the male is rare, but it exists. So males do have a vestigial mammary gland that is not developed during development. My guess is that those cells that exist in small numbers in the male are under constant negative inhibition by dopamine. The brakes by dopamine are never released. The brakes are not released. So that is to say, dopamine is always inhibiting those vestigial breast cells in the male, and they are never producing milk. But I could imagine, I think there are probably some endocrine abnormalities where the dopamine receptors in the lactotropes of the male were defective, and so the brakes are defective, and so I could imagine there could be a situation, I'm imagining, I don't know this, that there could be a situation where male breasts produce small amounts of milk. I don't know that. I do know that men can get breast cancer, and it's cancer of the mammary gland, the small amounts of mammary gland that males have.
Gotcha.
Why males still have nipples and mammary glands, I don't know. It would seem like evolution would have gotten rid of those structures. Why bother? But the evidence is that there's something there. Anyway, so now we have another end hormone, another hypothalamic hormone, somatostatin, inhibits the release of growth hormone and other hormones from the anterior pituitary. So you can see that the somatotropes express a positive feed-forward stimulation by GHRH to produce growth hormone, and they respond to somatostatin to inhibit the production of growth hormone. So GHRH and somatostatin are working in balance to control the production or inhibition of production of growth hormone. TRH and somatostatin are working to control TSH. So we have negative feedback. Thyroid hormone is giving negative feedback, and we have negative feed forward by somatostatin. Negative and positive control leading to homeostasis. We're going to come back to that repeatedly. Thing to think about is somatostatin is a hormone that puts the brakes on things like growth hormone, TSH, and downstream from that would be thyroid, insulin, and glucagon for the control of blood sugar. We're going to get to that. Questions about this table? Spend a lot of time on this table. We've got another table. Now we're talking about the hormones of the anterior pituitary. So remember, let's just do the first one. ACTH is released by the corticotropes of the anterior pituitary. What does it do? It stimulates, so it has a target, the adrenal cortex. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to make steroid hormones, and we'll talk about that more on Wednesday. TSH from the thyrotropes stimulates the thyroid to make thyroid hormones. We've done that one. Growth hormone from the somatotropes of the anterior pituitary have many effects on, by somatic I just mean the body, many effects all over the body. Growth hormone receptors, the receptors for growth hormone are expressed everywhere, and they have many effects. And it affects transcription, translation, cell division, cells that need to be dividing, the skin, digestive tract, cells that are sort of constantly being turned over, blood. Many of those cells express growth hormone receptors that stimulate, that sort of maintain that level of turnover and development. And you can imagine if there's a defect in the growth hormone receptor, it's not just that you're short, you could have all kinds of effects. LH and FSH, released by the gonadotropes of the anterior pituitary. So LH and FSH are both produced by gonadotropes, so gonadotropes should be here too. LH and FSH, both produced by gonadotropes, affect the female and the male reproductive organs. And we'll talk about their effects next week. So this is a slide from your textbook that summarizes the two tables, right? Here's the hypothalamus. Here's the portal circulation, the median eminence, portal circulation. Here's the anterior pituitary, and here's the rest of the body. So this slide covers what we just covered in the previous two in one sort of graphic. So if you like graphics, this is better. GnRH stimulates, let's do it. GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, stimulates the somatotropes to release growth hormone that have many effects. Somatostatin turns off the somatotropes and inhibits the production of growth hormone, and balances the effects in many cells. So positive feed forward, negative feed forward, and what we're not seeing, where's TSH? Positive feed forward, and then you have to imagine negative feedback. So this slide covers the same material. If you like graphic representations, use this slide. If you like more table-based information, use these two slides. The posterior pituitary, vasopressin and oxytocin release have effects. We are not going to talk about the kidney until you get to AMP2. We will talk about the effects of milk ejection and uterine contraction in the very last class when we talk about childbirth, labor and childbirth. Pregnancy, labor and childbirth. Okay, so let me see where we're at. I have a couple of clickers, but I think I'm going to skip the clickers in the interest of time, and you assign them as homework. So remember, your job is to study clickers, problem set, coloring book, rewriting notes, etc., including this clicker. So I'm just going to skip over it real fast. This clicker, and move on. I want to introduce the concept of stress and endocrinology. So this is our roadmap for the rest of the course. We're going to end with reproduction. We're going to start with cortisol. You can tell I'm trying to think about how much to do today and how much to put off till Wednesday. I want to introduce some things. So I want to introduce the idea that stress, and I'm not just talking about psychological stress, I'm talking about physiological stress too. The stress of running a marathon, the stress of running away from the dog that is chasing you and is going to hurt you if it gets you. But it's also true that the same stories can be told by the stress of knowing that the final exam is coming up in 2.5 weeks, less than 2.5 weeks. That's a stressor. So stress, both psychological and physiological, is detected in the brain, right? Your brain is detecting whether you're running away from the bear or the dog, right? That's a fight or flight response. Your brain is detecting that you are working really hard to run the 22.6 miles or whatever it is to run the marathon. Your brain is detecting, oh my God, I've only got 2 more weeks and then I've got a final exam. That's your brain. The hypothalamus is connected to you as part of your brain. The hypothalamus releases CRH. At least some of the hypothalamic neurons release CRH. The anterior pituitary, the corticotropes of the anterior pituitary express the CRH receptor and release ACTH. So ACTH is part of the stress response, physiological and psychological stress. ACTH, its target is the adrenal cortex, where it triggers the release of cortisol. And cortisol has multiple effects that are essential, not just during stress, but during regular life. Blood pressure control, blood glucose control, growth and metabolism control, immune responses are all effects of cortisol. I'm going to do one more slide and then push things off until Wednesday. Let's talk, so cortisol is produced by the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is the important target of ACTH that is produced by the anterior pituitary. Let's talk about the adrenal gland for a minute from an anatomical perspective, and then we'll finish up for today. The adrenal gland is sitting on top of your kidneys. Some of you have seen it in the cadaver from last year, and others of you will see it if you take AMP2, I hope. It's a gland, and it sits on top of the kidneys. Some people call it the suprarenal gland. So you may know renal refers to kidneys. Suprarenal means above the kidneys. The adrenal gland has a medulla, which just means middle, and it has a cortex, which just means surface, or it actually means like the rind of an orange or something. It means the top, the surface. So we have a cerebral cortex, we have a kidney cortex, we have an adrenal cortex, adrenal medulla and adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex has 3 different layers, and I do not want you to memorize the names of these layers. And I do not want you to memorize which of the hormones are produced by which layer. That's medical school level knowledge. If you go to medical school, they will want you to know that the zona fasciculata is producing cortisol. but not here. What I want you to know is that the cortex produces the steroid hormones, and the medulla releases the stress hormones, the stress amine hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So you've seen these as neurotransmitters. Now we're going to see them as hormones released by the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal cortex produces steroid hormones, including cortisol, but also sex hormones and aldosterone. And the medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the idea here is that the ACTH is stimulating the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. Let's stop there because the next slide is complicated. I'd like you to be fresh when we get to this flow chart. So we're going to start on Wednesday with this response to stressors. Stress, CRH, ACTH, cortisol. We'll unpack this on Wednesday. Okay, I think that's it for today. Remember, working on this every day is what is important for solidifying your knowledge. Problem set, coloring book, review for the quiz, telling the stories, rewriting your notes. Some of you are doing this all the time and you're doing great, and I want to say keep it going, and others of you should do some more of it in order to do better on the assessment. See you Wednesday.